Muchas gracias. Ahora
Thank you very much. We will now proceed with the consideration of the outcome of the Islamic Republic of Iran based on the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its annex. These documents, together with the additional information which will now be presented by the Islamic Republic of Iran, will be the basis of the outcome of the review and will be adopted by the Council using the standard decision-making procedure. It is now a pleasure for me to give the floor to His Excellency Ismail Mahanej, Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the United Nations Office at Geneva and other international organizations in Geneva. He will provide us with additional information on the review. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, human rights is a common good, and all states, large and small, are entitled to truly contribute to that protection. Protection and promotion of human rights as a shared cause emanates from, while at the same time contributes to, human solidarity. Without a deeply felt sense of human solidarity, we would hardly be able to nurture empathy needed to shield human rights against all kinds of infringements and transgressions. The current international climate, weathered by greed, egotism, unilateralism, xenophobia and self-centered winds, is obsessively hostile to nurturing genuine human solidarity to protect, let alone promote, this common good. The pathological addiction to radical unilateralism of all sorts, including unilateral coercive measures, plus unbridled resort to military force, have turned human rights into a main casualty of today's international relations. Right now, for instance, while Iran is struggling to contain coronavirus pandemic and to protect not only our own citizens, but also the whole humanity against this scourge, Iran's health capacity is viciously targeted by the United States unilateral sanctions. That's something that the Council cannot afford to ignore, since it is deliberately affecting the basic rights of a whole population. Equally disturbing is the increasing instrumentalization of human rights for political purposes and geopolitical gains. For years, a number of developing countries, Iran being one of them, are scapegoated for human rights violations, while in fact human rights is only being abusively invoked as a tool to stigmatize and antagonize the targeted nation. That's sadly how human rights has been manipulated by a few states as a tool of convenience for defaming and demonizing their adversaries. It is against this backdrop that the UPR mechanism becomes exceptionally important. Iran has been one of the main supporters of the UPR ever since its establishment and has actively and constructively engaged in the process. During its third UPR session, Iran received 329 recommendations and have submitted its responses to those recommendations prior to current session of the Human Rights Council. Let me thank all states that constructively participated in the third cycle of Iran's UPR and presented their recommendations. We will make our best efforts to implement those recommendations. I will pass the floor shortly to Mr. Majid Tafreshi, Deputy Secretary of the High Council for Human Rights of Iran, who will make further elaboration on that. In the meantime, I would note that Iran will continue its interaction and cooperation, both bilaterally with interested member states and with the Office of the High Commissioner, to contribute to promotion and protection of human rights for all. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Madam President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to address this body today to inform you the final position of the Islamic Republic of Iran regarding the recommendations made during the UPR session in last November by distinguished delegates. The Islamic Republic of Iran, in its third cycle, received 329 recommendations. We have examined each recommendation carefully, with the participation of all related institutions and civil society. The final position of my country is reflected in document UNHRC/43/12, Addendum 1. After extensive consultations and considering our national laws and international commitments, and based on the principle of securing human dignity and promotion of human rights, the Islamic Republic of Iran has accepted 188 recommendations in whole or partially. It does not accept 123 recommendations and has noted 18 others since to be in contradiction to the country's constitution and legislation, or in violation of the Islamic values, cultural norms and principles which is recognized under international human rights law. Iran also found few recommendations based on untrue information or bias. Madam President, based on the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a religious democracy. The promotion of human rights is a fundamental principle in my country and roots in Islam, which believes in inherent dignity of human beings. In the past 4 decades, Iran has had tremendous achievement in different domains, such as boosting democratic institutions and civil, political rights, education, poverty eradication, women and children rights, the rights of persons with disabilities, and health and sanitation. Madam President, Iran has always tried to develop its cooperation with High Commissioner Office. Iran's efforts to collaborate with human rights mechanisms include preparing its national reports at the convenient time, sending the third and fourth periodic report to the Committee on Rights of Child, and defending its first report to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities are some examples here. During the past 4 years, Iran has cooperated constructively with a special procedure and mandate holders of the Human Rights Council and has responded to these mechanisms. In line with the protecting and promoting human rights, Iran is engaged in bilateral dialogue with interested countries as well. In connection to the subject of right to life, it is necessary to make it clear that based on domestic law and international commitment, the deprivation of life is only considered for most serious crime. Iran has amended its national law on the punishment of narcotics drug traffickers in 2017, which led to 90% reduction in death penalty. Let's not forget that Iran continues to be at forefront of combating narcotic drugs. Madam President, concerning a number of recommendations on the rights of children, I would like to say the following. In line with promotion of the rights of children and adolescents, the adoption of the Bill on Protection of Children and Adolescents in August 2018, along with the other important enforced or ongoing measures, in an important step towards protection of children. Another human rights improvement is that child offenders will be held only in the Center for Correction and Education for maximum 5 years. That penalty will not be forced if the perpetrators are under 18, and it's good to know that the reduction here is around 98%. Let's say we are so close to reach 100% or zero death penalty here for children. Madam President, torture and ill treatment in Iran are forbidden under the Constitution and Islamic teachings and values. It is also forbidden based on national criminal law and international commitments. Those who commit this ill treatment shall bear the responsibility and made accountable according to the law. Exploring the recent guidelines and procedure issued by the head of judiciary, which runs to 30 documents, all confirm the maximum effort of the judicial force to enforce justice and securing due process of law. The guidelines to protect and promote the human dignity and human values in judicial force, approved in 2019, is also one example which aims to enhance accountability. In this line, due process of law, interdependence of judges, access to lawyer, fair trial, forbidding arbitrary detention and torture and equality against the law have been strengthened. Regarding the recommendation on women's rights, which have been mainly accepted by Iran, I would like to emphasize that after the revolution and even during the uprising which led to the victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, women have been the pioneers. They are active in many policy-making processes and national programming. I would like to mention the documents on promotion of women and family life, the law on transferring nationality to Iranian women who have married foreigners, the protection plan, and dignity and securing the safety of women against violence are some of the regulations and laws that have been developed and approved at the national level. At the moment, women are half of our students' population of the country. 30% of jobs that require high levels of education are devoted to women. 37% of the physicians are women. The presence of women in management system is 18% and is supposed to increase to 30% in next year. I shall mention that at the moment, women are at the high official posts such as deputy president or advisor to the president, advisor to the head of judiciary, member of the parliament, ambassadors, judges, and etc. The Islamic Republic of Iran is determined to continue its efforts to strengthen women's rights in law and practice. Concerning the rights of religious minority, I should emphasize that in accordance with the Article 3 of our Constitution, political and social freedoms, participation of the public in determining the political, economic, social and cultural destiny, and the removal of unjust discrimination and the provision of just opportunities for everyone in all material and intellectual fields are stipulated and guaranteed. There are no restrictions or exemption before law, and all citizens are equally protected by the law. The rights of religious minorities, ethnicities, as well as social and political orientation are enshrined in the Charter and the Citizen Rights, and all government departments are required to observe it. The Act on Despite the Settlement and Conciliation stipulates that religious minorities may have their own dispute resolution councils. Adoption of the law on the presence of religious minorities in the council, the criminalization of insulting religious recognized in the Constitution, alongside 5 parliamentary seats for religious minorities despite their very small population, all are notable achievements in this area. Civil rights, including freedom of expression and access to information, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, as well as political and social participation, as set forth in Chapter 3 of the Constitution under the heading of the Rights of the Nation, and the Citizenship Charter are explicitly guaranteed and in practice has provided a good atmosphere for the effective activities of journalists, reporters, media, and NGOs. Significant legal capacities in the field of political and civil rights have been already put in place, and the government is committed to enforce. Some of them are establishment of a center for dissemination and free access to information, the government guideline on securing free access to information, cabinet decision on securing peaceful assemblies and associations and assemblies, the charter on political dialogue, and the guideline on the development of NGOs, participation in securing citizens' rights in the bureaucratic system. Despite the cruel sanction imposed against Iran, today we are proud to be a pioneer country in terms of information technology and communication. We have more than 46 million internet users for our population. As for the recommendation on the terrorism, I would like to remind that both the Iranian authorities and people have constantly been victims of terrorism. Supporting terrorism, extremism, and promotion violence and insecurity, disturbing the stability and security of nations through creating of terrorism groups by a number of countries, especially in the Middle East, that I don't see any need for further elaboration on that, and our ambassador may in the final session talk about it. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, we believe that strengthening the UPR mechanism and following the principle and objectives of the UN Charter in line with multilateralism will promote human rights. I thank you, Madam Chairman, distinguished friends.
Agradezco a la
My thanks to the delegation of Iran for those statements. I will now open the floor up to member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of this review. Speaking time is set at 1 minute 30 seconds for all states. I give the floor to Philippines.
Filipinas.
Philippines?
Si no está en sala.
If Philippines are not present, we will move on to the next speaker, which is the Republic of Moldova.
El siguiente orador es
The next speaker is Russian Federation.
Thank you, Vice President. The Russian delegation welcomes Iran's passage through its third UPR cycle. We note with satisfaction that Iran has adopted the majority of recommendations put to it, including Russia's recommendation on the need to further enhance national legislation harmonization with the international human rights instruments that Tehran is a party to. We highly rate Iran's cooperation with the human rights treaty bodies and openness for dialogue as part of the UPR. Russia is against a politicized, selective use of the human rights issue. We note that illegitimate unilateral sanctions against Iran violate fundamental human rights and the interests of the Iranian population. Russia recommends adopting Iran's third UPR cycle report. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to China.
副主席女士，中国代表团。
Madam Vice President, the Chinese delegation welcomes Iran's active engagement in the UPR, commends its effort to eradicate poverty, enhance social security, protect the rights of vulnerable groups. The UCMs imposed on Iran by certain countries have had a major negative impact on the human rights of the people. At this critical juncture, when the government and the people of Iran fight against COVID-19, China calls on the international community to work with Iran in the fight, urges the relevant parties to immediately lift the unilateral sanctions to prevent further harm on the human rights. China thanks Iran for accepting China's recommendations and hopes the country will continue to drive economic and social development to provide solid basis for the enjoyment of all human rights, further development, education and health, and to win the fight against the virus. China supports the Council to adopt the report of Iran. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Sri Lanka has the floor.
Sri Lanka welcomes the delegation of Iran and appreciates the constructive engagement during the third UPR process. We note with appreciation that Iran has accepted 143 in full and 45 partly out of 329 recommendations received from delegations at the UPR review in November 2019, including 5 recommendations made by Sri Lanka. We appreciate the government of Iran for hosting refugees and asylum seekers and its efforts to provide them with appropriate resources in the field of education, healthcare, livelihood, housing, etc., despite its own challenges. We welcome the progress in the area of education, including the high rate of enrollment of children in primary and secondary schools and policy interventions for empowerment of women through ensuring higher education, government employment, business and entrepreneurship. The implementation of the Health System Development Plan, through which it has achieved increased life expectancy at birth, reduced mortality rate of infants, children, pregnant mothers, and control of non-communicable diseases, deserves appreciation. In conclusion, Sri Lanka recommends adoption of the UPR report of Iran and wishes Iran success in implementing the accepted recommendations. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
السيدة نائب الرئيس.
Madam Vice President, we would like to thank the delegation of Iran for their presentation, and we commend the active efforts undertaken by Iran to increase their health services by building medical care in rural and urban areas, and its efforts to combat COVID-19. In addition to the negative impacts of the UCMs on the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Madam Vice President, we have actively cooperated in the discussions of the report, and we thank Iran for accepting the recommendations advanced by Syria and its cooperative attitude towards cooperating with the human rights mechanisms. In conclusion, we recommend the Human Rights Council to accept the report of the UPR of Iran, and wishing all success to Iran in the implementation of the recommendations accepted to continue promoting and protecting human rights in Iran, and wish all success and welfare to the people and government of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Madam Vice President, the United Kingdom welcomes Iran's engagement with the UPR. However, we're deeply concerned by the human rights situation and Iran's continued refusal to allow the Special Rapporteur access to the country. In November last year, we saw the most deadly crackdown against its citizens for decades, while persecution and discrimination towards religious minorities continues unabated. We welcome the temporary release of several thousand detainees following the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak, and together with France and Germany, we have pledged support to UN agencies to assist Iran in combating the outbreak. However, we share the Special Rapporteur's concern about detainees, especially dual nationals, and urge Iran to release them on humanitarian grounds and ensure they are afforded suitable health care. The UK encourages Iran to engage fully with the UN and the international community on their accepted recommendations and implement them fully. We regret Iran did not support any of the UK's 3 recommendations, which were to demonstrate detainees are not tortured or subject to cruel or inhumane treatment or punishment, to allow an impartial trial process so defendants and lawyers have access to charges and evidence, and to investigate sexual exploitation of children and develop a protection plan. Nevertheless, we remain open to discussing these recommendations with Iran. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Venezuela. Thank you, Madam Vice President. We welcome the esteemed delegation of the Islamic Republic of Iran and thank it for its presentation. We commend the government on its full cooperation with the UPR mechanism. We welcome the answers provided by the government during the review, in which it confirmed the country's steadfast commitment to protecting people's human rights. Amongst other things, we've underscored that according to the UND report from 2018, that despite the illegal sanctions imposed by the North American empire, Iran is at the top of the countries with a high human development index of 0.798. Vice President, Venezuela congratulates Iran and expresses its acknowledgement of the country's progress in implementing recommendations accepted during the second UPR and the government's full will to achieve these aims. We wish Iran every success in implementing accepted recommendations during this, the third UPR. For the above reasons, we recommend the adoption of this report. Thank you. Thank you. I now give the floor to Vietnam. Vietnam?
Está en la sala. Doy la palabra.
Vietnam is not in the room, so I give the floor to Afghanistan.
Afghanistan welcomes Iran's continued engagement in the UPR process. My delegation notes with appreciation Iran's full support to our recommendations to set up a national human rights institution and to protect the human rights of refugees in its territory. We note Iran's partial support for our recommendations to ensure that children of registered refugees and unregistered foreigners are provided with birth certificates. We hope that Iran will consider giving the recommendations its full support in the future. We recommend that the Council adopt the report with consensus, and we wish Iran every success in the implementation of all accepted recommendations. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Belarus.
Madam Vice President, we welcome the delegation of the Islamic Republic of Iran and congratulate them on the successful passage of the third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review. We note with satisfaction the fact that, pursuant to the review, Iran adopted the majority of recommendations directed to it, either fully or partially. We note with understanding the country's position with respect to those recommendations that were not adopted, particularly in view of their wording that was not constructive. Belarus proposed recommendation concerning further strengthening of national capacities in the sphere of promoting and protecting human rights in view of the concluding comments of the treaty bodies and the recommendations of the UPR. And Iran supported this recommendation together with other recommendations. We'd like to wish Iran success in implementing the recommendations accepted in view of the national interests and needs of the country. We recommend to the Council that it adopt the working group report on the UPR of Iran by consensus.
Palabra Bélgica.
I thank you. I give the floor to Belgium. Thank you, Madam Vice President. Belgium appreciates Iran's engagement with this UPR. My delegation also appreciates the fact that one of Belgium's recommendations has been accepted, that is the recommendation to fully ensure the rights to the freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly and association by creating a conducive environment, particularly for women human rights defenders and lawyers who are experts in defending human rights. Belgium would like to know exactly what measures, what tangible measures you plan in this regard. Nevertheless, Belgium regrets the fact that its two other recommendations were not accepted. The first concerned the minimum age for marriage and the eradication of the practices of early and forced marriage. The second recommendation concerned the abolition of the death penalty, at least for crimes committed by people when they were under the age of 18, and that all death penalties against young offenders be commuted. My country thinks that these two recommendations are important, and we invite the authorities to review their position on them. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Thank you. I now give the floor to Botswana.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Botswana warmly welcomes the delegation of Iran to the adoption of the UPR outcome. We appreciate further updates provided today. At its review, Botswana commended Iran for the extensive normative and legislative frameworks undertaken in the last cycle. Notable were measures taken to protect the rights of persons with disabilities, reduction of working hours of women with special conditions, as well as the review of the draft bill on the National Human Rights Institution. We also took note of education and training on human rights across different sectors. We welcome Iran's acceptance of many recommendations covering a wide range of human rights issues, including one from Botswana. In conclusion, we support the adoption of Iran's UPR outcome and wish them every success in the implementation of all accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Filipinas.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Philippines.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation acknowledges the importance attached by the government of Iran to the UPR process. We thank Iran for supporting all three recommendations presented by the Philippines relating to economic participation of women, climate change, and training for duty bearers. We welcome Iran's committed efforts to ensure universal access to education, with emphasis on the education of girls and vulnerable groups. The Philippines supports the adoption by the Council of the UPR Working Group reports on the Islamic Republic of Iran. We wish Iran every success in the implementation of all the accepted recommendations. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. This was the last speaker that could be accommodated. Allow me to remind that all statements, including those that were not delivered due to the time constraints, should be placed online. I give the floor now to civil society organizations and other stakeholders to deliver their general statements. I give the floor to Society of Iranian Women Advocating Sustainable Development of the Environment.
President, implementation of UPR recommendation require availability of multiple resources. Unfortunately, the recent economic war imposed on Iran through comprehensive economic sanctions is threatening many lives inside Iran and destroying the environment, making it very difficult for the country to maintain the existing infrastructures. The ban on banking transactions prohibits the use of green technologies and put the environment protection programs in a lower priority. Madam President, my organization is highly concerned about all human rights of people of Iran, especially the right to a healthy environment, which is being extensively violated through comprehensive sanctions. We call on the Human Rights Council to pay due attention to the fact that unilateral measures adopted by some countries are intended to seriously violate human rights in other countries, including the target state and many other third states who are engaged in international trade with the target state. We call on all member states who attend the UPR working groups to condemn any resort to unilateral measures that violated all economic, social and cultural rights of the people in the target country, including the right to a clean and healthy environment. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la...
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the Disability Association of Tirana.
While welcoming the adoption of the Protection of the Rights of the Disabled Comprehensive Act, Disability Association of Tirana calls on the Islamic Republic of Iran to make enough and effective efforts towards the implementation of this act. The current law is a complete law, and if it is applied properly, there will be good achievements for the disabled. While highlighting Article 5 of this act, which stresses on medical services insurance for the disabled, Tirana calls on the Islamic Republic of Iran to make all efforts to provide insurance coverage for the disabled, in spite of the economic pressures from unilateral coercive measures. While welcoming Islamic Republic of Iran's actions toward the promotion of the disabled rights to education, calls on the country to expand its efforts for the provision of education opportunities for the disabled, especially in rural regions. Tirana calls on the Islamic Republic of Iran to continue its cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the reporting procedures towards the improvement of human rights, particularly the disabled, in spite of the politicized actions of some governments in confronting international human rights mechanisms. We call on the Special Rapporteur on the rights of the persons with disabilities to note and investigate the impact of unilateral coercive measures and secondary sanctions on the disabled communities of countries that are targeted. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Advocates for Human Rights.
Ausentes. Tiene la palabra.
Absent. Baha'i International Community.
Madam Vice President, the Human Rights Council is about to adopt Iran's third Universal Periodic Review. During each of these reviews, a number of recommendations have been made regarding the persecution of the Baha'is. 5 recommendations in the present report list the violations of the rights of the Baha'is, yet Iran has rejected each of them. The only reply that Iranian authorities have given for these rejections is to say that the people of Iran enjoy equal rights. This rhetoric is not new, and regrettably, it is not true. 2 years ago, Iran's Foreign Minister Zarif said that being a Baha'i is not a crime in Iran. Yet the Special Rapporteur tells us that the arrests and imprisonments of Baha'is continue, adding to the thousands detained, tortured, and jailed since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Mr. Rahman also detailed many other ways that the rights of the Baha'is have been violated, from hate speech campaigns against them to the denial of higher education and ongoing policy of economic apartheid. Today, Iran's government has found a new way to discriminate against the Baha'is. A mandatory new national ID card application allows citizens to select only Islam, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Judaism as their religion. The Baha'i faith, recognized around the world, is denied in the land of its birth. Iranians without ID cards cannot carry out the simplest tasks of life. Applying for loans or work permits, opening bank accounts, making property transactions, and many other tasks are impossible for 300,000 people because of their beliefs. In November, during the UPR working group, The head of Iran's delegation, Mr. Larijani himself, said that Iran deals with the Baha'is according to the citizenship contract as normal citizens. So how can Iran explain denying Baha'is as a basic part of life? If Iran truly claims that the UPR is an appropriate tool for the international community to address human rights, they should have the courage of their convictions and follow these recommendations to improve the situation of the Baha'is. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor for a joint statement, Lawyers for Lawyers.
Lawyers for Lawyers and the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute welcome the decision of Iran to accept some of their recommendations relating to the rights of lawyers made at its third UPR. We are indeed concerned by the reported cases of lawyers representing clients in sensitive cases who, without reason, are denied access to their clients and are subjected to harassment and convictions on improper grounds. States have the primary responsibility to protect lawyers for them to discharge their function without interference, intimidation or harassment. However, since January 2018, multiple lawyers have been arrested, detained or sentenced to lengthy prison terms in connection to their professional activities, including lawyer Nasrin Sotoudeh. We are also deeply concerned about a note appended to Article 48 of Iran's criminal procedure regulations. This note provides that in cases of crimes against the security of the state, suspects have to choose a lawyer from a pre-approved list. Anyone charged or suspected of a crime has the right to be represented by a lawyer of his or her choice. Any state restriction to this right can only take place for compelling reasons and must not prejudice the ability of the person to receive effective and independent legal assistance in order to answer the case. There are real dangers that a list of state-chosen counsels undermines those minimum criminal guarantees. We urge Iran to effectively implement the accepted UPR recommendations without delay and take immediate measures to ensure that sufficient safeguards are in place to guarantee the full independence of lawyers and their effective protection against any form of undue interference in their work, including their prosecution on improper grounds. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to the World Jewish Congress.
Thank you, Madam President. The World Jewish Congress notes, with a measure of skepticism, the Islamic Republic of Iran's apparent pledge to safeguard the rights of religious minorities through representation in parliament, but remains appalled by Iran's contemporary mistreatment of minority citizens of diverse ethnic, religious, linguistic, sexual and gender-based backgrounds. As a preeminent example, followers of the Baha'i faith are not represented at the parliamentary level in Iran and reportedly have been subject to arbitrary detention, confiscation of property and other gross human rights violations. The Baha'is' institutional discrimination by the Iranian regime must be immediately halted, investigated and condemned. In order for human rights to be truly upheld, safeguards must be universal and cannot be implemented selectively to some minorities over others or to some rights over others. The World Jewish Congress therefore calls on the Human Rights Council to condemn in the strongest terms Iran's ongoing persecution of its own citizens as flagrant human rights violations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Give the floor to Organization for Defending Victims of Violence.
Madam Vice President, Iran has supported about 13 recommendations on various aspects of development, especially improving the socio-economic development of the country, continuing the education, health and social services in rural areas, expanding its health insurance coverage to all citizens, development of the infrastructures, protect the rights of persons with disabilities, and reaching the Millennium Development Goals. However, the comprehensive unilateral coercive measures imposed on the country have created multiple challenges on reaching all development goals. This form of UCM, which is considered as economic war, deprived the target country of many resources, including national source of income, all international banking transactions, and all exports and imports. Madam Vice President, ODVB calls on Iran government to fortify its efforts to remove obstacles that prevent full implementation of recommendations and benefit from more consultations offered by the civil society members, especially NGOs. Draw the attention of the UPR mechanism to HRC resolution on UCM, especially 37/167 that calls on all relevant UN human rights treaty bodies and subsidiary organs of the HRC to mainstream the issue of the negative impact of UCM on the enjoyment of human rights and perform specific activities, such as during the review of the periodic report submitted by state to such bodies and under the Universal Periodic Review. ODVB urged the Human Rights Council and all member states to pay due attention to the negative impact of consequences of UCMs on implementation of all recommendations. Thank you, Madam.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Give the floor to Amnesty International. Absent. In that case, Article 19, International Center Against Censorship.
También está ausente.
Also absent. The British Humanist Association.
Tiene la palabra Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We are particularly dismayed that Iran rejected a majority of recommendations with regards to ratification of core human rights treaties, in particular the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention Against Torture. Iranian officials first discussed ratifying CEDAW more than 22 years ago, yet Iranian women continue to suffer from many different forms of discrimination in law and practice with respect to marriage, divorce, inheritance, and occupying certain professions, including the highest elected office in the country. Iran not only rejected recommendations for ratifying the Convention Against Torture, but also rejected several recommendations regarding the investigation of specific cases of alleged torture and criminalization of torture in national legislation, even though torture in detention remains one of the most serious concerns of the independent monitors. On February 18, the BBC's Persian service published a detailed account of the psychological torture and threat of physical torture during the interrogation of Niloufar Bayani, a former UNEP consultant and one of 8 members of an Iranian environmental NGO who have been detained on bogus espionage charges for over 2 years. Bayani has shared an account of the inhumane treatment she experienced in detention when she appeared before a judge in February 2018. The judge's response was to bar her from attending her own trial instead of investigating these allegations. Bayani's case is only one of several cases of torture reported over the past year. We also regret that Iran rejected several of the recommendations to protect the right to freedom of assembly. Iranian authorities in November carried out a brutal crackdown against protesters. Human rights groups estimate that 300 people, including bystanders, were killed during the protests, and video footage shows security forces using excessive and unlawful force to repress the protests. After 4 months, authorities have not announced the total number of deaths and have not provided families of victims with any answers as to what happened to their loved ones. Iran has a serious accountability problem. Failure by authorities to investigate serious human rights violations has significantly damaged public trust, which further diminishes the government's ability to manage a crisis such as the current coronavirus outbreak. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene ahora la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Rabot Bemayesh Research Educational Services Cooperative.
Thank you, Madam President. In recent years, following the U.S. unilateral withdrawal from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and the Security Council Resolution 2231, the new U.S. comprehensive sanctions are imposed on Iran. The subsequent increase in currency fluctuations in Iran created many problems for both Iranian students residing abroad and for the students studying inside Iran. The increased cost of living, coupled with challenges in financial banking transfers, have impacted the lives of the students in a way that the sense of social insecurity among them has been very high in the media and social media in the past years. More than 6,000 Iranian students studying abroad are facing banking and money transfer issues. Madam President, as a representative echoing the voices of many Iranian students to the Human Rights Council, we believe that the short-term and long-term effects of scientific and banking sanctions can have irreversible effects on the right to education, as well as the right to development and other economic, social, and cultural rights of Iranian citizens. Our organization calls on the Human Rights Council monitoring mechanisms, including the special procedures mandate holders, to offer recommendations on lifting the comprehensive sanctions against Iran. Considering the fact that Iran has supported UPR recommendations on continuing its efforts to promote access to education for all citizens, including the women and the people living in rural areas, we call on all recommending states to pay attention to the obstacles created by comprehensive sanctions on the way of promotion of the right to education. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Give the floor to Iran Human Rights Documentation Center.
Tiene la palabra Ensemble contre la peine de mort.
Ensemble contre la peine de mort, absent. International Federation of Human Rights Leagues,
Ausente.
absent.
Center for Inquiry.
Report shows that the Iranian regime is making no attempt to form a more just society. Human rights continue to be violated in all areas. Secularists, humanists, atheists and converts to other religions continue to be sentenced merely because of their worldview. As an example, Sohail Arabi has remained incarcerated for 6 years because of Facebook posts in which he criticized aspects of religion. Even now, as the regime is releasing prisoners, as it cannot control the coronavirus outbreak, it continues to target non-Muslims and political prisoners. Despite of having set more than 100,000 inmates free, only a handful of apostates and individuals who are fighting for their own and other people's human rights have been released. People attempting to form a more just society are not a risk to the country's national security. Unlike the inadequate measures taken against the coronavirus outbreak, we urge the Iranian government to invest in the health system, not in the repression of free thinkers. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Give the floor to International Federation for Human Rights League. This was the last speaker then that we could accommodate. Before giving the floor back to the Islamic Republic of Iran for their final comments, let me state that in accordance with the information provided, 143 recommendations were supported by the Islamic Republic note, and we take note of 186 recommendations. I give the floor now to His Excellency Ambassador Hamaneh for his final comments.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank all the delegations that participated in today's debate on Iran's third cycle of UPR. Iran remains determined to continue its efforts to promote and protect human rights. As we have already explained, Madam President, Iran has examined all recommendations we received during our UPR session with open mind and in a spirit of cooperation and engagement with the Council and with Member States. And of course, certain recommendations could not be noted simply because they were not meant to be considered as such. Many of them were mainly a set of repeated allegations and, unfortunately, a number of biased propositions. We have made huge efforts and tremendous progress in promotion and protection of human rights, despite all the odds. Unilateral sanctions, deliberately devised and enforced to pressurize the ordinary Iranians, have not distracted us from the right path of safeguarding the Iranians' human rights, in particular the right to health, the right to education, and the right to development, as well as in the areas of women's rights and children's rights. Now, under the US economic sanctions, the so-called maximum pressure campaign, which is unfortunately being supported by certain numbers of delegations who have been talking about Iran's human rights situation for a long time, have been supported by them. The right to health is the prime casualty of those sanctions. And I wish those speakers who took the floor today in criticizing Iran's human rights performance, and some of them unfortunately were so unfair as to repeat a set of baseless allegations, would have shown the courage to note that the whole populations basic human rights are being targeted on a systematic and brutal manner by the United States sanctions. Expression of concern over Iran's human rights would hardly be regarded as genuine and honest, while the same peoples who talk about human rights are in one form or another are complying with those sanctions and justify it as secondary sanctions. So with that, Madam President, I thank you and thanks other delegations for their participation, and we remain committed to implement the recommendations we have accepted. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to the delegation of Iran for that presentation and for the constructive participation throughout the UPR process. I now propose that the Council adopt the decision on the outcome of the UPR of the Islamic Republic of Iran as it appears on the screen. If there are no objections, it's so adopted. We'll now take a brief break before we move to consideration of the outcome of Angola.